Okay. Welcome to another Sunday Superversive live stream. I am your host, Ben Wheeler, and today I am retreating into the shadows with a trench coat and a cigarette to tell people secrets that would end in my suicide. But until then, Anthony Marchetta, Caroline Furlong, and Goldeneye will be discussing comics origins, its history, and its business, and what dark business it is. I, a man of many secrets, am disgusted by comics and the fact that people know about them. But hey, I'm gonna go hide under a bridge and whisper secrets. Take it away, Anthony.
Hello, I am your host today because Ben is disappearing, Anthony Marchetta, and as our guest we have Vincent Edling, who is an expert on comics and the history of comics and comic books, and has been working for, I think, a few years now on trying to figure out ways to fix the business, and Caroline Furlong, who is a frequent guest of the show and an authoress, as well as a big fan of Marvel and comics, and she expressed interest in being a part of this discussion, which makes a lot of sense since I don't actually read comics. So, to be clear here, in terms of the American comic book industry, the extent of my real expertise is I'm a fan of Miller's Born Again comic series, which is my favorite ever. I really like Miller's Dark Knight Returns. I'm a big fan of The Long Halloween, and I'm a big fan of Ross and Wade's Kingdom Come. And these are all extremely basic bitch comics to be a fan of. You know, like this is the comics for babies stuff. So getting people who know their Marvel and their DC and their history is really good for a discussion like this. So welcome to both of you.
Thanks for having me on.
So I know that Vincent has been preparing pretty thoroughly for this discussion, which is great, and I am glad that he has been. So I'm just going to let him dictate here. Where do you think that we should be starting in terms of a discussion like this?
Can you guys hear me right now? It's going in
You're a
and out.
little quiet, but I could hear you.
Okay, I think I'm gonna have to move the mic a little bit closer. I'm gonna have to hold it. I was hoping I could not hold it for this, but I think I'll have to. So I'm typically a little bit more interested in the business than a lot of people are, and this is partly because I thought about starting a business. So if you're talking about the origins of comics as a medium, you can find stuff going back to like the 1800s is like the first ones for sure. There's a guy named Rudolf Toffer. You can even find some going back to the beginning of the printing press. But if you're talking about as a business, it really, really gets popular in the newspapers. And there was a comic feature called Hogan's Alley, which had a character called the Yellow Kid, and this is in 1897. And this is when it starts to become very, very popular, because what you have to understand is that newspapers were competing with each other. And so when the Yellow Kid became popular, the newspaper that was a part of became popular. And so there's this very, very large attempt for a very long time to start publishing more comics because it would increase the circulation of the newspaper. And also, as of note, the Yellow Kid is actually the one of the first characters that was ever merchandised. So merchandising has pretty much been with us since the beginning of it as a business, basically. And this is part of the reason why comic strips could be justified as part of the publishing of a newspaper. And so,
Okay, so that's interesting. The the newspaper comic industry is actually something just for, reasons of my own from a few years ago. I know a little bit more about the history of than like, Marvel and DC in them. For whatever reason, I can't even recall why, but I got somewhat interested in it a while ago. Newspaper comics are a really they're the modern versions of them are so grossly distorted from what they were and could be. A lot like Marvel and DC, actually. Though I would argue that the current state of newspaper comics is even more abysmal. especially considering the heights they once were at. Like, what you get with newspaper comics is the absolute scourge of legacy comics. So, which are comics that should have died when their original creators quit or died, but they kept continuing on and on and on, well past their expiration date. Blondie is endemic of this. Uh, the modern incarnation of Blondie is not good. The original version of Blondie was actually quite a creative comic with quite an interesting premise that evolved into what we currently have, which is this bland suburban comic with weird holdovers from, the 1930s and whatever when it first aired. Like the fact that they have a little kid who just wanders around into Dagwood's home, Elmo, and there's no explanation for this, and they don't even try. He's a holdover from a completely different era of living, and we don't really get any info on like the history of Dagwood and Blondie's relationship, when in fact their history is pretty funny. Like Dagwood was rich and Blondie was a flapper, and Blondie marries Dagwood for his money, but because he marries a flapper, his father cuts him out of the will. So they end up being poor, which is actually like a creative idea, and now it's just like you lose all of that in the modern Blondie comics. Or you get things like Mary Worth, which, nowadays is the comics curmudgeon who makes fun of newspaper comics, like, acknowledges that Mary Worth is a complete joke today. He basically treats it almost like a gag. As well he should, it's terrible. But the original Mary Worth was called Apple Mary, and it was a Depression-era strip. And it involved, which, by the way, King Feature Syndicates denies that they're the same comic, but they almost certainly are, from, like, people who have pieced together the run. And Apple Mary was actually about a woman whose husband died and who became poor in the Great Depression and had to sell apples to survive. Again, a much more interesting premise than the current version of Mary Worth, which is she is an old lady. And that's it. That's the premise.
They had a lot more room to be creative back then too, which if you start reading the history of it, not all of them are good, but there's a shocking amount of them, especially that are pretty creative. It's well
Oh,
worth looking into
absolutely.
if you're interested. If you're interested in comics as a medium, because what you find when you read a lot of the really early comic books is that they were all inspired by these newspaper comics, because that was part of the popular culture at the time, and newspapers were a huge part of the average American's life.
Yeah, and I would argue that the last truly, I mean, I don't think I'm going to say something that's very uncontroversial. I think everybody's going to agree with me. But the last truly innovative comic that made use of the newspaper as a medium, in comics as a medium, was Calvin and Hobbes, right? Infamously. And it's interesting because I used to not really like Bill Watterson. I thought he was like, one of those artsy fartsy, like, art first, don't care about money guys, and I don't agree with that perspective. But the more I actually read his quotes on the matter, he comes across as a lot more humble than if you just hear the story in a vacuum. Like, basically, the way he tells the story of Calvin and Hobbes is that when he started writing the strip, sometime in the middle of his run, he was getting disillusioned about not being able to do everything that he wanted to do, so he took a sabbatical, and he seriously considered quitting. And then he decided that he would come back, but only if he was given permission to draw what he really wanted to draw. And this is why in the second half of Calvin and Hobbes' run, you get these absolutely gorgeous Sunday strips. Seriously, like works of art. So, Calvin and Hobbes, he says that when he did this, it sounds like, he made a demand. Either you show my full, incredibly detailed Sunday strips or nothing. But that's not really what happened. He basically said, look, I'm not really that interested in coming back at all, but if you want me back, then you're going to have to give me some space to draw, and if you don't want to carry the strip, then that's fine. And he claims that every newspaper, to his great surprise, who previously had Calvin and Hobbes, continued to carry it with his new uh, stipulations, except for one, which is amazing. But unfortunately, it didn't really lead to any lasting change in the industry, which is quite sad. I think as of today, there is only one newspaper in America that actually carries full Sunday strips with the header image and with nothing cut off, and that's like the Houston Eagle or something like that.
I think you might be talking about the Houston Chronicle, but yeah, it's.
Possibly. I'm not sure.
I mean, Watterson is the last really. I think probably the last really, really good one that used it. The last superstar one that was actually good was Peanuts. Unambiguously so. I mean, it's amazing that it went for like I think 40 years, and it didn't devolve.
The thing about Peanuts, though, so you're right, Peanuts was brilliant, but so was Calvin and Hobbes, right? And Peanuts was brilliant, though. I wouldn't minimize Peanuts for the world. It's great. And Peanuts ran all the way into the early 2000s before Schultz hung it up. So I think it actually outlasted Calvin and Hobbes by a little bit.
Yeah, but I mean, he was working on that up pretty close to the day he died. Schultz worked very, very hard on that comic, but he got really wealthy off of it.
He did. Schultz is an interesting guy, deeply flawed, but he seemed to really, believe in his Christianity. And I like to think that Charles Schultz has a place in heaven dedicated to him for A Charlie Brown Christmas, which is an absolutely remarkable cartoon. The fact that it exists at all is insane to me. Like, that they allowed it to be made, and they allow it to air, and they allow the Christmas, like the Christian stuff, is unambiguous. It quotes the Bible directly. It is such a thoroughly Christian story. It's amazing.
I'm just surprised it hasn't been canceled yet. I wonder why they haven't.
Yeah.
They canceled the Halloween special for Peanuts a few years ago because of the bullying. Probably because all the bullies are girls.
Do they really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, they I can't remember the exact terms used, but they did say that they weren't going to be running the Charlie Brown Halloween special because it showed bullying. And if you watch the Halloween special for any length of time, you can pick out the bullies easily enough. They're all girls. Lucy is a bully, and she's the chief bully. There's a reason. She says at one point in the show, a person should always wear a costume that is in direct contrast to her personality, and she puts on a witch mask.
That's funny. Yeah, I don't think I've seen Yeah, I don't think I've seen the Halloween special in a while. Sorry, I got distracted by something for a second. I haven't seen the Halloween one in a while, but I watch the Christmas one every year, and yeah, you're absolutely right. I don't know how it hasn't been canceled. Maybe because people would riot. But it's an unambiguously Christian work that directly quotes the Bible and is thoroughly orthodox, and for all Christian denominations, because it quotes one of the central stories of the Christian narrative in a way that doesn't really take a particular doctrinal stance on it, except to say that this is the story. So it's an incredible cartoon, and it was Charles Schultz. But we're a little bit off topic, but I agree with you, Vincent, that Peanuts, I guess by dint of technicality, it started much, much, much earlier than Calvin and Hobbes, like almost 30 years earlier. But it also ended later than Calvin and Hobbes, because Calvin and Hobbes famously ran for a decade, and then Bill Watterson retired at the top of his game. Charles Schultz was not at the top of his game when he retired. Peanuts had a run that was probably brilliant through like the 60s, started going downhill a little bit starting in the 70s, and was kind of running on fumes by the time Schultz retired. It wasn't bad per se. It was still Schultz doing it. So it was still like the original creator and his input, but ultimately, I think that it definitely wasn't, peak Peanuts by the time it ended.
Oh no, but there's just so few artists who can maintain that level of quality over 4 decades. I think it's almost impossible to do. So, I think it's best to compare like peak Peanuts at the peak of anything versus any other strip. It's the fairest comparison.
Yeah, I would agree.
I agree.
And this also goes into another thing because Watterson didn't want to be merchandised. And as I pointed out earlier, one of the reasons why it can exist as a medium, at least for newspapers, was because of the merchandising. So he was leaving money on the table when he didn't want Calvin Hobbes to be merchandised, especially that Hobbes doll. I guarantee you, it would not have been as popular as Snoopy, but he would have been very easily been able to make more money than he did just off the whatever he got the salary that he got from working on it and any collected editions. And it's hard for an artist to leave money on the table, especially in a business like that.
The really incredible thing is that if Bill Watterson decided to merchandise Hobbes, he would be a rich man right now.
He would be. I don't know if he'd be like a multi-millionaire, but he could probably not have to work for the rest of his life because I think his comics are they're better collected than Schultz's are, than a lot of other, and also than a lot of comic strips. And I think the quality is higher, more consistently high.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, part of it was that, like, in the second half of Calvin and Hobbes' run, you get this explosion of, like, just insane Sunday strips. This absolutely gorgeous artwork that nobody else at the time was doing, and nobody has done since.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that requires a thing called talent, and that's always in short supply.
It's hard work.
To be fair to the comic strips, I don't think that they're all totally worthless. I think that Pearls Before Swine has a very meta sense of humor, and he's quite critical in his comics of the larger comics industry. His artwork is not good, and Stephen Pastis, the creator, who is very public and even got Bill Watterson out of retirement briefly to do a few Pearls Before Swine strips. I think he would admit and would joke about his art not being good. Partially it's a style, but still. But I think that Pearls Before Swine is generally pretty funny. I also respect Pastis because he is very critical of the comics industry. In his strips, he makes fun of Family Circus, he makes fun of Kathy, he makes fun of Slylock Fox, all of these comic strips that were coming out. The flip side of this is that you get absolute sludge like Garfield, and full disclosure, I absolutely loved Garfield as a child, and I contend and will argue that Garfield up through the 80s was actually pretty okay. Like, I think it's an amusing strip through the 80s, but by the time it got into, like, its modern era starting in the 90s or so, it was just this mass-produced block of nothing, and that's what it is today. And it's the most popular comic strip ever, which, Jesus wept.
I still like Baby Blues.
Baby Blues isn't bad. I would agree. I think it's an amusing strip.
Zitz has its moments too.
Like, good, I'm sorry.
No, I was just gonna ask Vincent. Merchandising is how they were making even more money instead, not just off the circulation of the newspapers through the popularity of the comics. What type of comics? How big were these comics originally? And did they? Because the ones we're all familiar with in newspapers now are like 3 panels. If we're lucky, we get 6 or 7, and they're all short, and you don't get to see much of them. I still have some clippings from, oh gosh, a decade or so back of 3-panel Spider-Man comics that were in some of the newspapers that I got to see. And so I'm just wondering exactly how much of the page did these take up originally when they first showed up in newspapers?
Well, it really depended on which section that you got. So there's the dailies, which were in black and white, and then the Sundays. The Sundays, if depending on the comic, it was not always, but really, really big comics. In fact, I actually have in my house on a shelf that's just too big. But the original Sunday for Gasoline Alley, which was a comic strip that was very, very popular in its heyday and somehow is still running, it was like 2 foot tall. It was basically the entire page for some of them.
Whoa.
I mean, these things are huge. When you see, I don't know if you guys have the 10th anniversary edition of Calvin Hobbes.
I think I've seen
I
it.
do not.
It's a 10th
Yes,
anniversary one.
amazing. It's
It's a good.
huge.
Yeah, no, well, he actually talks about the size of newspaper comics, and I didn't really understand his complaints about it until I physically had copies that were kind of close to the size. I thought these
Yeah,
things are huge, and
yeah,
this was the normal standard one. Now they didn't draw that big during the week, but on Sunday, like you had an entire page dedicated to it, and then as it progressively shrinks and shrinks and shrinks, you can't do that, and that's part of the reason why newspaper comics besides declined, because they kept shrinking periodically. And then once you get to about World War II, there were newsprint shortages, and they basically permanently shrunk them, and it was basically gone after that point, because you can't do the large size that visually was so popular with people who read it. And then there's all the cultural shifts that happened after the 1940s. America became suburbanizing, and then television, of course, or as some people derisively refer to as the idiot box, started to become more popular, more part of the American culture. So newspapers sort of declined on it, and they've never been able to recover from that because it's just no longer culturally relevant. It's basically the internet now these days is, I guess, the closest that you could have to the common American culture.
yeah. I mean, we don't really have a common culture anymore, right? Somebody was pointing out where they go like, "Oh, the latest Marvel movie or whatever," and it's like, no, you have no idea. Like, Endgame broke records and whatever. They said like the big tentpole releases in the past, there were it was way more culturally pervasive than even like the MCU is now. You just don't understand. The population was smaller and there was less entertainment. So this is what everybody watched.
One of my favorite. This is an anecdote I
Hold
learned
on,
when I was
just
reading this.
just as a way of example of what Anthony's talking about. There used to be a lot of shows when they had like nothing else on called like top 100 movie quotes. And the thing about them is that you can't have top 100 movie quotes that even good Christian boys in Missouri, who don't really have a social life, could quote, even though he's never seen the movie, is because the culture is so ubiquitous, people would literally quote Casablanca in casual conversation. It would show up. And not just in these top 100 lists. In casual conversation, people would quote Casablanca, Rosebud, etc., etc. And not ironically either. I just wanted to say that because like a lot of people in the internet age think, oh yeah, memes. Well, if everyone's looking at movies, the memes come from the movies. So you still have the same meme penetration, but it's different because it's the culture. That's all I wanted to say. I'm going back. I've got a line on Hillary Clinton's taco dealer, and I'm sure he's got some juicy secrets.
Keep us
The other
informed.
thing, I would say too is back in the day, the Looney Tunes were conveyors of higher culture through funnies. When you see them playing specific, when like Bugs Bunny shows up in the auditorium to play a certain type of music, the children who watched it and laughed at the adventure or the fun or the hilarious escapades would recognize the music when it was played later. This was so you could have people. I can't remember the name of the episode with the hats where they um, take on different personalities when they put on certain hats. Then there you had the Barber of Seville with Bugs Bunny. This allowed people to recognize the Barber of Seville when it was played. Um, this allowed people the one where um, Elmer Fudd wants to go and kill the wabbit. That particular one exposed you to that particular opera, so you could recognize the music. I grew up watching reruns of of Bugs Bunny, so there's certain types of music and certain aspects of it that I still recognize. And if they get played again later, it's like, wait a minute, I know that tune. Oh, that's the Barber of Seville. And this was what they mocked the Looney Tunes and said, no, these are too violent. They're corrupting the next generation and blah blah blah. So the Looney Tunes got canned. And in the same, and this is actually what, it's not just the internet has taken over as the means of cultural exchange in America. It's that a lot of the creativity and storytelling techniques that were used to propagate the culture, like the Looney Tunes, like the Sunday Funnies, like um, even Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys and the Pulps and other books like these, were systematically shut down, marginalized, turned into a niche, or just shut off because they're too this, they're too that. We're still exposed to this kind of thing anyway these days with um, you can't say X, you can't say Y. We call it political correctness now and have for a few decades. But it was the same idea back then. Uh, Pepe Le Pew is the latest victim, and one of the things that someone pointed out in the big furor over canceling Pepe Le Pew is he was a way of exposing Americans to foreign cultures because after they came back from World War II, the GIs had been exposed to all these different European cultures, so they had a broader perspective on the world and everything else. And since we were starting to travel more after World War II, people, especially little kids, they wanted them to be exposed to this and understand now this is what's going on, and this is why they do this, that, and the other thing. So you would get it visually and be stimulated visually to understand, okay, that's what this means. And you would absorb it in a fun medium that um, was very obviously not real. Nobody walks away when an anvil is dropped on them after they fall off a cliff, a la Coyote, the Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner. But these were things that just you picked up by cultural osmosis. You can do that again today too if you pay attention and curate the types of movies or the types of books you read. And if you have people helping you, family members, etc., or a group of friends or a club, this will help you pick it all up. The problem is mainstream entertainment and mainstream education isn't doing that anymore. And this is, I think, Vincent, where the comics came in and when they were this big, then so we started out with comics in, you said 18, I can't remember the year, 97, or was it 1870?
1897 is when it starts as a business. You can see
Ah,
other forms of it, but this is when it gets as a business. Because the thing is, you're in the business of making art. You can have other, like the film, film, starts as, oh gosh, like at the late 1800s, but I don't think they started doing businesses until like the 1900s. So it's, just because you have the medium doesn't mean you can make money off of it. Yeah. That's part of why the Yellow Kid and the section that he was in, Hogan's Alley, was so important because it showed you could make money off these things. And now there's a good reason to invest more money in it, which means that you can make more comics.
so how do we get from newspaper comics like that to the more familiar comics, even of the I think it's the golden age where you had DC start up first, and I think before that you had the Shadow. Didn't he start out in move from the pulps to comics and so on and so forth?
The Shadow was originally from Street and Smith Publications. Comics were originally just a way to reprint newspaper comics. They sort of, and they actually started, let's see, I have in my notes, let's see, roughly 1934, I think is the first form of it. But it kind of just moved along because they didn't really have anything novel to really sell themselves at the time. So they kind of just were just moving along. Dell Comics, which is the big publisher for a very, very long time up until like the 60s, and they started kind of fall off a rock like everybody else was publishing stuff. But there was but Superman, when he came out in 1938, is really, really important because he did something that a lot of people don't realize. what people don't realize is that the newspaper comics were aimed at adults mainly. Now, the Sunday comics were aimed a little bit more available to kids, but the primary people who buy newspapers are adults. And so all the comics in the newspapers were for adults. So when Superman comes out, Superman is Superman. He's very popular. He's still as popular, even though, the actual comics themselves, I don't think have been really popular since like the 60s, really. But what happens is that it basically splits it, and it creates this really weird split because it means all the newspaper comics are for adults, and now the comic books become for children. And this creates a very strange problem because it means you don't have, the comic books in general were kind of not a great place to work, and it was for children. And so they kind of ended up having a lower status. In fact, I remember I was reading in one of the books I was researching, there was the guy was citing an article that was written like in 1949. It had like the cultural hierarchy of importance of certain mediums. And at the very, very bottom, below the pulp magazines, was the comic books. That's how bottom of the barrel they were. And nobody wanted to work there. And in fact, the way that you can tell that nobody wanted to work there was that consistent credits were not even a thing until the 1960s. And most people who drew for them did not sign their artwork because you didn't want to be associated with it. Whereas if you compare with newspaper comics, if you read those, they'll happily have their signature somewhere in there that they made it.
Okay,
That I did not know.
So, what was DC like? How about this? How did DC start? Because DC was the first one that really, took off from the Golden Age, if I'm understanding it correctly, right?
They were the first one to become. They were the first people who had something that showed it could exist on its own. Dell Comics is technically first. They were actually the first publishers of comic books in the form that we understand it today. But they never were able to get anything popular, and that's why Superman was such a huge hit because they had a character.
So that's what I was going to ask. Was it Superman?
So Superman, he's sort of like what the Yellow Kid is. He's not the first one, but he's the first one who showed it was worth worth making as its own business. And he also simultaneously, because Superman was so popular, it allowed it to exist by explicitly targeting children. And this is part of why we're probably not going to talk about the comics code today, but this is part of the reason why they were so aggressive about it, because comic books were primarily for children, whereas the newspaper comics were primarily for adults. And people are more sensitive about what their kids read. And that's just how, and for good reason. So. But it does mean that if you start getting hysterical about what stuff is in there, the biggest criticism is that they were really overly violent, and that's something. Having seen some of those comics, that's something I'm a little sympathetic to, a little bit.
I think it's understandable to be more concerned about what your kids are reading versus what adults are reading, because kids are at a vulnerable age and you're in charge of what what media that they sort of take in. So I'm somewhat sympathetic to things like the comics code and stuff like that, and early Superman being, a very wholesome character, right? Now, I'm going to switch tacks slightly, but I've read some, not a lot, again, because I'm not a big comic reader, but my brother bought an anthology of, like, early Golden Age Batman, the first Batman comics and everything following them. One thing that you get that's interesting about early Batman is, Batman has had many lives, right?
Yeah.
Like, Batman has been incredibly silly, Adam West's 60s Batman, which was really just following off that Silver Age sort of era of Batman that got kind of silly. And it's gotten, very gritty and serious. The Batman, what's his name? Michael Keaton Batman, that was it.
Yeah.
And of course the Christian Bale Batman, so you have all of that stuff. But one thing that interested me was you get the question of what was Batman originally intended to be. So, if you read the early comics, I would say that, people often credit Frank Miller with bringing Batman into this, modernized, gritty direction. with some justification. Even if he was not the first to do it, he was the first to popularize it in a while. However, one thing that's interesting to me about reading the early Golden Age comics is that they are definitely pushing in that grittier, if you want to go like, what are Batman's origins? I would argue that the gritty direction that Frank Miller took it in is closer to the origins and original purpose of Batman than the campy direction. Would you agree with that, or do you think that I'm going too far with it?
No, I mean you have to remember too. Like even though technically it was for kids, they're willing to be pretty dark on it. And you have to remember Batman is a takeoff of the takeoff with quotes of the Shadow. So it's the Shadow. If you listen to his story, it's gonna be pretty dark too. So that's pretty. I would argue that the dark menacing interpretation is probably the norm. Like you could do the silly one, but I would say if you
Yeah.
wanted to go back to the origin of it, it's always intended to be dark gothic.
I bring this up because I've defended Frank Miller on those grounds before. I'm a pretty big defender of Miller, right? Like, I think Miller is a genius, and I think that comparisons with Moore are generally unfair. Uh, because Moore was a deconstructionist, and I don't think that Miller was. I think then in his later worse works, after like his golden run, he kind of turned into that. But the works that made him famous, I don't think. I think it's inappropriate to call them deconstructions or anything like that. I think that's an incorrect classification. So that's how I've defended Dark Knight Returns, which I think is a very good comic book. It's not my favorite Miller work, but it's good, and I think it's better than Year One. But that's another story. Uh, I think the Dark Knight Returns, it's this darker, grittier take on Batman, right? But I defended it as, well, Batman had gotten away from its roots, and sure, he takes it probably darker than the original comics did because they couldn't take it that dark, based on their audience and whatever. But like the very first Batman comic involves, Joker falling into a vat of acid. And the only reason he wasn't killed is because they liked the character, not for any moral reasons. They certainly were willing to kill him. Uh, so I would argue that Miller is definitely he was interpreting Batman in a way that was almost like an update that brought him back to his roots with an original story, that sort of thing.
Vincent, I have a question.
Yeah, what's up?
You said that the main reason the comics code took off was the violence in the comics. Can you give us some idea of what that violence might have entailed? Because something I've noticed, and again, this goes kind of back to the Looney Tunes, that was obvious, silly violence. It was, there's no way once a little kid gets used to it, they realize, okay, this could never happen in real life. And so they don't worry about it anymore. They're just enjoying the show. Something I noticed recently about cartoons from the 90s, the Batman animated series, for instance, or Gargoyles, is they were much darker, and Batman itself actually didn't mind implying some really terrifying nightmare fuel, such as the time Clayface becomes, well, Clayface, he's held down, and you don't see it physically, it's just shadows on the wall. It's held down and has the formula that eventually turns it into Clayface poured down his throat. So if it's violence like this, where it's done via shadows and implications, and if somebody really stops and thinks about it, and kids are bright, of course they'd stop and think about it, you can pick it up. But if again, this goes back to the problem with the Looney Tunes. They said it was too violent, but the actual violence that it quote unquote inspired is pretty much non-existent. You actually have more incidents since then with children watching wrestling. There was one story decades ago about a boy who practiced a wrestling move on his younger sister and killed her. So that didn't happen when it had stuff like the Looney Tunes on. Is this case similar to that, or was there more going on?
Well, the main thing that really got people's attention was crime comics, really, and that was a big one. And you have to understand that a lot of, especially horror, was something else. And if you want to know how graphic it could get, I would recommend just Googling horror comic book covers in the 1950s. There's some stuff that's pretty. Let me put it this way: if you were to
It's
make
borderline pornographic.
well, no, not just that. It's one of those things. If you were to have it realistic, like somebody to do this, it would actually be nausea-inducing. I think not all of them, but there's a number of them. I think that'd be pretty nausea-inducing. So that was part of what that was, and horror comics had an outsized impact. There's worry about crime comics as well. Although I would point out, in fairness to some of those crime comics, the most popular crime feature was a comic called "Crime Does Not Pay," which I think is a little on the nose for what the message is. But that's this was they weren't necessarily the most talented people in the industry at the time. So we're not talking about like very comedic violence. We're talking about pretty graphic violence. It's not really the same thing. That was part of why the parents were just so shocked by. And remember, comic books are their main audience is for kids and young adults. So this is perfectly reasonable.
Yeah.
And yet,
Okay. That's interesting. Thank you.
it's pretty bad. I probably wouldn't let my kids read some of it.
And if it wasn't the cover, it was almost certainly the advertising. Like, I remember a couple things from some comics my dad had stash. It's like, you're basically missing the nipple at this point, Queen Queen Nefertiri or whatever. Like, it's they weren't wrong.
No, they weren't wrong at all. I mean, they were pretty vivacious, and I think it is because it was aimed towards kids that it really got them. There was genuine concern there. It was not overly hysterical necessarily. In fact, there's one.
Yeah.
Because
what were you
Go
gonna say?
ahead.
No, I remember, and it's been a while since I read it. Someone was talking about how the Comics Code prevented certain scenes in Marvel. Now, some of them were probably fine to leave out, but certain other ones you could consider harmless. And you'd had to wonder why did they think that this was in this particular setting, and it probably affected DC somewhat too. I say somewhat because I'm not as well read in DC as I am in Marvel. It, but it would make you wonder if the main reason that the Comics Code took off was because of the horror and true crime comics. That would make more sense. But that's the thing that people generally leave out, and this is actually something else that's interesting. Is most people think comics, they think superheroes. They don't stop to think the Sunday funnies or the funny papers, as they used to be called. They don't even think about any genre outside superheroes, but these used to exist. You used to have romance comics, you had horror comics, you had true crime comics, and westerns as well. So they were all over the place.
Yeah, unfortunately, that is one thing. The crime stuff was really especially got hit by it, and horror, romance got affected by it a lot as well. They kind of it's hard because the problem is that on one hand, I'm not a believer that those genres are intrinsically bad, but on the other hand, there's just so much bad schlocky material. I understand why they were so insistent on trying to get that under control, because it's not like they were necessarily even particularly good horror comics.
Mm-hmm.
They're not really, from what I can tell, they're not really that great, and and unfortunately just brought the hammer down on it. And the thing is, the industry did shrink after that quite a bit. I'm trying to see if I actually wrote it down in my notes over here. I probably have it somewhere. Oh yeah, here we go. So after the code, there are about 650 titles in circulation. After the code came into effect, it's like 250 titles on the marketplace. There's about 15 publishers also went out of business as well after that, and a lot of those are people who specialized in horror and crime stuff. So it did cause a pretty broad shrinkage in the industry, because the problem is that I think crime fiction is probably one of the most popular genres of fiction if you're going to do it, and that kind of shrunk a lot of the, and when you cut the publishing of those titles, you shrunk the market a lot. And of course, romance, of course, is absurdly popular. So if you cut that down, you're cutting out some of the most popular genres.
That would make sense, and it would explain several things.
Oh, were you going to say something, Anthony?
Go ahead.
Oh no, you were starting a conversation. I just finished what I was going to say.
Yeah, what I was going to say is what you were talking about, like with the loss of genres and things. So this is something that I've noticed in comparisons between the industries of countries and regions of the world, I guess more accurately, that have successful comic book industries versus the American comic book industry. So one of the big lies that is promoted currently by Marvel and DC, because they're so incompetent at what they do in terms of selling comics,
Now,
is that the comics don't sell. This is just straight up false. It is not true. It is not only not true, it's almost the opposite of true. Comics are big business, and they are doing crazy well in Europe and Japan. But one thing that you notice about European and Japanese comics is that superheroes are a very, very small part of them. The equivalent to what we would think of as, like, superhero comics in the West, the dominant genre, would probably be shonen. But there are several differences. Number one is that, as anybody who is a fan of manga will tell you, shonen is not a genre. It is not at all a genre. It is an age range. It is specifically an age range. It is specifically the market of young boys, and although there are shonen battle stories are a genre, and they have certain tropes associated with them, the individual details of such stories can be wildly different. So that's one problem. Another problem, and of course, the fact that I say shonen, but to think of shonen as being monolithically dominant in the same way that superheroes are in the West would be reductive, because shoujo, which is similar age girls, and seinen, slightly older young men, are also huge industries in Japan. And they also are not actually genres in themselves, so there are tropes associated with them, but markets where lots of different genres are used, and even within those tropes, you have a ton of variation. Something happened in the American comic book industry that absolutely crippled us, because we did not always used to be like this, where everything was superheroes. This is new.
No, and even if the superheroes were a large chunk of the American market, this is why it goes back to my question on violence. Did these horror comics, did these true crime comics, they might have been perceived, comics themselves might have been perceived as being for children, but were they in fact the equivalent of seinen, which is older, like teens, mid-teens, probably 15 or older, were able to read these kinds of things? And the superheroes were for younger kids. What was the age range? What was the age market for these different comics before the Comics Code hit? Because if the Looney Tunes I use as an example because I'm familiar with them, but there's a wealth of things that changed when the Looney Tunes were taken out of the picture. So if this could happen in essentially in one market, in one entertainment field, the Comics Code could be used to shut down these. And yeah, some of the horror comics, I looked up the images. They're definitely not things you would hand to little kids, but were they something for older teens? If the perception was skewed somehow that these were for like 10-year-olds, then yes, the Comics Code knocking them out of the business is perfectly legitimate. But if they were aimed at late teens or mid-teens, then you have to wonder kind of what's the problem. If they're aimed at children who are not as susceptible as a 10-year-old, if they're aimed at a 16-year-old or a 17-year-old, yes, they're susceptible. The human mind remains pliable until the age of 25. So you can basically brainwash anyone 25 and younger if you use the right techniques. And they are open to impression. This is where we get fashion trends like snorting Tide Pods. But if it, which demographic were they worried was being affected? Because if true crime and horror, you might end up with some people who were too young reading some of these comics. But if the general market was no, you the superheroes are over here, kid, you go and read those. You and the store owners at the time, there was a time in the 1950s when no one had to lock their doors across large swaths of the country because they knew the neighbors knew them. There was no crime in the area except once in a blue moon. So if you had this kind of setup where the rules were unspoken and people watched out for each other, and people in small towns particularly knew each other's families, so that the mother in one house, when the kids in the neighborhood were out playing, was watching everybody's kids and would tell the mothers of certain other ones when the children were misbehaving. If you had this kind of a setup and you had this kind of, I don't know what the proper word would be, but a barrier to young kids being exposed to something they shouldn't, something R-rated, then why institute the code? Why attack something that is, if not harmless, not aimed at a demographic that can be harmed?
All that much regulation on it. The oldest I've ever seen quoted, this is from I think from an interview from one of the people who was involved in EC Comics. I think the oldest that I've ever seen quoted is like 16. You know, nothing higher than that. But you have to remember that there really wasn't all that much regulation in terms of who did this one. Just in terms of like who bought it, the newsstand stuff. That was actually a controversy because when they had the Senate subcommittee hearings on juvenile delinquency, which that's also another reason why the code was talked about, was because there was some question about, there was an increase in juvenile delinquency post World War II, and there was a question about, what the cause was. And they actually had a very substantial portion of the hearings that were just dedicated to what's called tie-in sales. And basically what that means is that you had to take, if you wanted something, you had to take something else involved in it. And there's a whole debate is about whether these newsstand dealers are being forced to take these comics that they didn't want to sell. And it just kind of went back and forth. I don't know. I think they actually ended up banning tie-in sales, I think in New York, within the other one. So there really wasn't all that much regulation of what was bought. And you couldn't do that with the newsstand dealers because they just have so much stuff that they would have to check for it. So basically, the only people who essentially were, controlling the content would basically be the buyer and whoever was publishing it, basically.
Because I just, that was something that occurred to me and I wondered about it.
Yeah, when you read about the history of it, that there was a lot of controversy over, the fact that the newsstand dealers, they thought that they were being forced to take comics that they didn't necessarily like, but there was just no way to deal with it, at least legally. I think they ended up banning tie-in sales, but a lot of, in fact, the first complaints about the first really substantially organized effort to really check the children's contents was actually organized by some members of the Catholic Church, which is actually what happened with the film industry as well.
Yeah, it's interesting if you look back at the history of the film industry, which by the way was always converged to one degree or another. They were just at one time. There were elements that were unconverged, and they were more cognizant of pleasing the public, but they absolutely were still making, like, even all the way back to the 20s and 30s, like the propaganda pieces just like now. They just couldn't be as blatant about it, and there were elements of it that weren't a part of that. But like they were like the Catholic Church was a I'm trying to think of how to put it. The Catholic Church was a group that mattered to them in terms of their opinion. They were still a significant influence on society. If the Catholic Church were to come out and tell people not to watch those movies, which they can and did do at times, this could significantly hurt Hollywood. Like, so they were actually cognizant of the church's opinion. Unfortunately, in my opinion, that is no longer the case. On the other hand, maybe it is fortunate since the people who would be making those calls are the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, and I certainly don't trust their judgment.
Not the ones who are there right now, no.
Yeah. um, sad, but it is what it is. But yeah, like it's just interesting to look at in the history of the United States and these entertainment industries. Uh, they really did care what the Catholic Church's opinion was once upon a time. Like, it was something that they really had to take into account, because if the church spoke out against something, that would hurt sales a lot.
Well, in fairness, there were a lot of Protestants who agreed with the other ones, with the Catholic ones as well, and they would team up with them because they didn't want the bad influence. This was actually a very ecumenical, to use a phrase that's become a buzzword. But it was very ecumenical. There was actually a great deal of there was actually more consensus on this in general.
There's if people are wondering, well, why the Catholics? The Protestants were the biggest group. It's like people forget that Catholics are much more collectivist in their thinking and acting. Whereas the Protestants each have their own little island. So if the Southern Baptists say something, that doesn't mean the Lutherans or the Calvinists or the backwoods churches or anything else do it. So in other words, if you offend the Baptists, but you offend the Catholics, oh no.
Yeah, I think just to explain it even more simply, the Catholics are organized into one large monolithic block. Consider it this way: the Catholics alone are nearly half of all Christians. Protestants make up the other half, and Orthodox kind of make up that last. I say almost and the Orthodox with them kind of make up that last like 50%. Protestants make up the other half, but Protestants are not a block. They are a group of various denominations, some of which are incredibly different from each other and don't agree at all on even essential points. So to think of them as a block is a mistake. However, if the Catholic Church says something, well, then you've got roughly half of the Christian world, and then any evangelicals who are kind of Catholic light enough to agree with them, meaning people like the Anglicans, the Lutherans, So it's a big deal.
Hey Ben, before we go on, how are we doing on time?
Oh, I'm about to head out. But Anthony has my number, and
I do.
He'll be able to contact me when you guys are done. I'm actually going to pop off. Let me know how it goes. I have nothing else to say, really, just because I've been listening in. It sounds really good. You guys are excellent guests. Goodbye. Goodbye.
Bye Ben.
Oh,
But yeah, we should probably do an entire thing just on the code, because it is fascinating how that developed and how how much effort was expended on it at the time. But that'll be for
that would be
that would be for a different stream, because that's just way too much to talk about, even in this stream.
that would be fun. So the Yellow Kid was what proved comics were marketable. Superman.
Superman was basically the proof that you could do comic books separately as their own industry.
So the Yellow Kid proved comics were profitable. Superman proved that comic books as a medium were profitable. Where did it go from there? And
So
How
How
does
did it
that
go
affect
from
today?
Okay, so they did. There's a lot of copycats of superheroes, which of course this is an industry in general that's not terribly creative. I would say the average for comic books is probably lower than it is for other industries. It's never been terribly well run, and this has always been a striking problem, and it's never really gotten away from this. It's gotten better over the years, but it's still never been very good. And I do want to point out something we didn't get to talk about earlier because we went on a sidetrack. If you want to understand why the industry has such a hard time attracting talent, when you talk about newspaper comics, because this is the thing that you got a lot of money when you were a newspaper comic guy, and I'll give an anecdote to explain why this was. So there's a newspaper guy named Milton Caniff. Were you saying something, Anthony?
No, I was not.
Okay, you had a little green light around your avatar, and it sounded like you were about to say something. So
Beats
there,
me.
it's probably just background noise. So anyway, so Kniff was a guy who made a comic called Terry and the Pirates. It's very influential. Anybody who's in that first generation of adventure comics, like Jerry Siegel was influenced by this, Jack Kirby was influenced by this, Will Eisner was influenced by this. They all loved Kniff. Kniff is I've read almost all of Terry and the Pirates. It's actually pretty engaging and entertaining. Even let's see, it started in the 30s, it ended like 34, and ended in 1945. So so he uh so he was uh he was actually given an offer by the Chicago Tribune to make a new comic strip. And I actually went into the inflation calculator to see what the actual amount of money that he was going to get. So in 1945, he was offered, if I have the number over here, hang on. I have it because I was just amazed how much money he got. Let's see. Let's see. Uh, this is what happens when you aren't organized by it.
So while you're looking that up, I'm gonna mention that right now we are still very far back in the timeline. Correct?
Yes, this is the 1940s, and I'll explain. And this is part of the reason why I want to bring up the salary. Okay, so here we go. So he got an offer. Now Terry was very successful, so he got an offer for this one. He had $525,000 in 1945 money guaranteed to come over to the Chicago. I think it was the Chicago Tribune. So I put this in the inflation calculator, and that meant he got guaranteed $8,275,050 in today's money, and he had the ownership of his own the ownership of his comic. That was how much money they were willing to pay. That's how important it was to have these people on staff, basically.
Wow.
He got paid a lot, and you look at people like, I think one of the really early comics guys is a guy named Bud Fisher who made a comic called Mun Jeff. He had part of it. I think it was him or another cartoonist. I can't remember, but he got guaranteed in his contract. He had a very high salary, and he got guaranteed Rolls Royces as part of his salary.
Ooh.
It was that important to have those people on the staff because it would drive up circulation. But for comic books, you were basically paid in a page rate, which wasn't very good. You had no royalties because royalties were not even standard in the industry till like, I don't know, like the late 70s, early 80s. And even when they did do royalties, like in 1980, when DC and Marvel did their attempt at doing royalties, only Marvel had every title meet the royalty threshold. DC only had like 2 to 4 titles that actually met the royalty threshold. So in general, you didn't have any merchandising rights if it was successful. Siegel and Schuster didn't have merchandising rights originally to Superman. They did end up acquiring them later. But in general, there was just no effort to really attract and retain talent. Whereas with newspapers, there was a very serious effort to make sure that people would stay and actually produce good work. And that's part of why they've always had such serious problems. It's just nobody cared about it. Nobody wanted to be there.
Yeah, infamously, creators of Superman got screwed over badly in terms of money and royalties. DC just absolutely did everything in their power not to pay them what they were owed for decades, and I don't think they ever actually did, honestly, if I recall the story correctly. I'm sure you've heard this, right?
Well, they got payment for it originally, and then Superman got successful, and I can't remember if they ended up renegotiating or they had to sue. I can't remember which one it is. And then they did end up start getting money from all the other ancillary stuff. But it is interesting, like the fact that they had to basically, the assumption was that there was nothing was worth staying, and so they had to go back and renegotiate that. And the interesting thing is that there's an entire history of newspaper comics being successful where things like merchandising were a part of it. And that's what's so fascinating. It's like how little that they cared about making it a place to stay and develop talent. And that was the attitude that they had. And that still kind of exists today to a very large degree. They don't want to spend the money
Yeah.
on developing talent, and that's part of why it's part of the reason why it's in such a mess.
So here's a question for you. Now I'm fast forwarding slightly, but yeah, this is all related. Uh, we're looking at the Marvel and DC comic eras, and they had a boom. DC is the first one to get big, then Timely Comics gets that generation of talent in with Stan Lee and whatever around the 60s. So about 20 years, I think, or so, 20 or 30 years after DC really gets cooking with Superman and, their classic hero hits, which are really just like comic versions of some of the pulp heroes that they kind of make more, visually interesting. I mean, that really is all that Batman is. He's just like a visually revamped version of the Shadow, right? Uh, but even Superman, like he's kind of a visually revamped version of some of like pulp heroes and whatever. Okay, fine. DC gets really big. They start doing well. We get to Marvel. Marvel starts out as Timely Comics, then they get in this generation of talent with Jack Kirby and Stan Lee and a bunch of different people, right? In the 60s, and they start to grow. And Stan Lee's big thing that made Marvel separate itself from DC is that Marvel decided, almost kind of on a whim, almost randomly, that they were going to care about continuity. And Stan Lee talks about this, where he says that the reason that he did this was because he realized that people who weren't going to read a new comic otherwise would read it if Spider-Man was in it. And they really milk this Marvel. It's actually kind of funny in retrospect. Like, if you read the first Daredevil comic nowadays, years later, first, it's not a good comic. The artwork is good. That's the biggest compliment I could give it. The writing is quite poor. But Spider-Man is plastered all over the comic. And not only that, Daredevil's origin, as originally written, is a carbon copy of Spider-Man with the serial numbers filed off, right? So they were really milking, the Spider-Man train, really milking this idea that if you just mention these other characters and you bring them up, people will pick up your comic just so they could see those characters get their one scene. And this helped Marvel to explode. But where I'm going with all of this is Marvel starts its decline after, Kirby leaves and Kirby leaves for DC and they have their decline and whatever, and then we get to the 80s. At this point, the comics industry is well and truly in free fall, which DC never recovered from. It's still in free fall to this day, and there are rumors of it closing down. And there are also rumors, by the way, of Marvel closing down, Marvel Comics. But what I'm asking here is, Jim Shooter started a mini revival, which we've discussed before in the Superversive Discord.
Yes.
Jim Shooter started a little mini revival at Marvel a decade or so when he was the editor, where Marvel all of a sudden and like almost miraculously started to make money again. Like, basically, you hate to say anything is single-handed, especially in an industry like comics, where it's so collaborative, but it's really, like, very much a Jim Shooter-led thing, to the point where he was quite unpopular, and this makes sense to me that he would be quite unpopular, because he had to take creative control. They were free falling, right? Like, of course he would be unpopular. He was telling people what they had to do. Only the directives and advice and orders he was giving were working. So what I want to know is, if the comics industry's issue was stuff like, distribution, and it was stuff like not giving enough money to good talent and things like that, like more business than ideological issues, what did Jim Shooter do to turn it around?
Well, the main thing is that the editorial offices in 70s Marvel were nightmarish to work in. They were in general were not very well organized. The key thing you have to remember about Marvel is and has always been, it has never been terribly organized well. This has always been true. Basically, going back, his is arguably one of the eras where it's actually professional. So it works in spite of the fact that it's despite of the fact.
Oh yeah, this is
not because of it.
You're correct. Infamously, Jack Kirby absolutely hated his time at Marvel. Only speaks about it negatively, pretty much, or only spoke about it, I should say, negatively, pretty much after he left, and he despised Stan Lee.
They did make up a little bit later, but I think he didn't. I don't think that was a good time in his life. And having read some stuff about it, I understand why. I sympathize with that.
But yeah, my impression of that whole the whole dispute between Kirby and Lee, I've always been more on Kirby's side of it. I mean, part of the issue is the Marvel, Lee gets so much credit for writing these characters, and don't get me wrong, he does deserve some of it. But the Marvel method of writing specifically was like, he didn't actually there was less input from Lee than there would be in other types of editorial processes. And yet Lee got so much credit, and this really, really pissed Kirby off. Like, made him livid.
Well, and I think it didn't help that Stan Lee was sort of the public face of the company. And another thing I've learned from reading people talking about comics is that people don't typically understand the process of about how comics are created. And so they usually tend to assign stuff to Stan that he otherwise, I don't think himself would necessarily take credit to, because most people don't understand visual storytelling at all. It's something I've noticed. Even people who are allegedly professionals, they don't seem to understand it very much at all. And it makes it very difficult to talk about it. But I would say...
Yeah, I mean, visual storytelling is very difficult, too, for that matter.
It's hard to have an educated discussion on it unless you've studied drawing a little bit. Whereas almost everybody is kind of familiar with prose, and so that makes sense. But when you're talking about drawing, like a part of the reason with why like the Marvel stuff is because of like distinctly Jack Kirby style visually, not just in the storytelling,
right?
But how everything looks, and that's hard to unless you have some understanding of visual art and how it works. It's hard to have a good conversation about it. I mean, like you could say I like this, like I love how Steve Ditko draws his stuff. But unless I have some kind of art training,
it's hard to get more specific.
It's hard to get more specific than that. But most everybody recognizes prose, and that's a lot more. That's just easier to talk about, and that's just a hard thing. And that's just I think part of why Stan just got so much. And Stan Lee's very talkative. He's very charismatic. Jack Kirby is not nearly as charismatic as he is. He's not like unlikable or anything. But you talk with like Stan Lee. He's very energetic, and Stan Lee is not nearly as much.
And I also think Stan handled it in a very smart way. As Kirby was making, really leveling some nasty accusations at Stan Lee. And again, I am sympathetic to Kirby here to an extent, so I'm not saying this like, how dare Kirby do that or anything. But Stan, I think very wisely from his perspective, pretty much did not strike back. And whether this was because he was genuinely the bigger man, or because he was smart enough to realize that that would be a bad idea from a marketing perspective, either way, it ended up making people more sympathetic towards Stan. One thing, though, that I know is that everybody talks about, like, Jack Kirby has a bad memory, like, he says this, but it contradicts this, but the problem with that, to me, is I've noted several, Kirby defenders who, again, don't entirely agree with, but I'm more sympathetic to, have pointed out is that, for better or worse, Kirby's story about what happened at Marvel did, in fact, remain consistent. It just didn't match up with what Stan Lee was saying.
You have to remember, too, a lot of Stan's contribution is really in his editorial direction, which I think also a lot of people don't understand, that, like, bad editorial can kill good artists. It's very, very easy for that to happen. And for the most part, he seems to have actually given a great degree of trust to Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko. And that's a great deal of trust that he has in them, and that's a big part of the reason why they thrived as well.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that's part of the Marvel method, right? The Marvel method necessitates a very high level of trust in your artist.
Yeah, because the thing is that Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko are sort of cartoonists in the classic sense. So it's really, really helpful if you have somebody else who kind of already does tell stories. And like Jack Kirby have been doing that for years. Steve Ditko have been doing that for years. So when Stan Lee and Jack Kirby talk about a story, he can assume that Jack Kirby will go off and will write a good story on this one. And even if they don't necessarily agree on everything, he'll at least do something that's probably good, or something that he can end up working with.
Yeah, like, if you look at that first Daredevil strip, I did an article on a few years ago, and I just looked it up to make sure that I got my, my name, the names right, my details correct. So, Daredevil was drawn by Bill Everett, and I criticized the writing of Daredevil, and I still do. I don't think it is a well-written story. It's not a terribly written story. It's certainly, like, everything holds together and that sort of thing, and it gives you, if you're a little kid, it probably will give you what you want in a superhero story.
It's
And
good, but not brilliant.
Yeah, I think even good is honestly overselling it. I think that it gives you what you want in a superhero story in an incredibly workmanlike but very unexciting and bland way. I don't think that Matt is a very interesting character. I think some of the contrivances are poor, but one thing that I need to give Daredevil issue #1 credit for, it was drawn by Bill Everett, and the artwork of generally that era of Marvel is just absolutely beautiful. It's brilliant artwork. The cover page of Daredevil is actually drawn, believe it or not, by Jack Kirby. Kirby drew the cover, Bill Everett inked it, and Bill Everett drew the comic itself, and the artwork is great. It is by far the best part of that comic. Now, there is a difference between it. The Literature Devil, who is a YouTube critic who I'm a fan of, he did a comparison of Daredevil issue #1 with Miss Marvel, the Muslim Miss Marvel that's now getting a TV series. And I remember reading Miss Marvel because it was nominated for the Hugos, and I was reading some of the Hugo works at the time. This was in the Sad Puppies era, and I remember thinking that, like, besides the woke stuff, which is risible and I don't support, I remember thinking that Miss Marvel #1 was meh. It honestly wasn't, like, I'm like, this is passable. It's not that bad. And I remember reading Daredevil issue #1 and going, Daredevil issue #1 is not good. It's bad. But Literature Devil analyzed the both of them, and I actually agree with his conclusion, which is that Daredevil issue #1 was a proper superhero story with a confident main character with a beginning, middle, and end that gave you everything that if you're looking for in a superhero story, it has it. But Miss Marvel did not. It did not give you everything that you're looking for in a superhero story. It did not tell a complete story, which is a big deal. And this is not something that he said because he was talking about the writing, but I will bring it up. The artwork in Daredevil issue #1 is vastly superior to Miss Marvel. So there is a sense where, like, when you're comparing the writing, you have to remember the genres as well. And Daredevil issue #1, for all of its very real flaws, was very much a meat and potatoes superhero story that if you're going in for action, if you're going in for, exciting exciting, daring do, and you want to meet this new character doing this cool stuff. It's gonna give you all of that and tell a complete story with a beginning, middle, and end, and establish a new cast of characters. Now, I think that Frank Miller's changes to the Daredevil formula were a vastly superior improvement to what Daredevil had, which is why I'm pretty forgiving towards things like what he did to Karen Page, that I know John Delarose has criticized. He criticized what Frank Miller did to Karen Page in Daredevil Born Again, where he makes Karen Page into a prostitute and heroin addict, uh, which is admittedly a very, very dark turn for what started out as a pretty bland secretarial character. But I'm pretty forgiving of that because I just don't think that Daredevil was all that good, and it needs to be remembered too, in terms of context, that Daredevil was on the verge of cancellation until Frank Miller almost single-handedly saved it.
Yeah,
That brings me.
Oh,
Sorry,
what were you gonna say?
you first.
Oh no,
No,
I
I
was
was actually gonna turn. Sorry, you first.
Oh yeah, so I was gonna say like Jim Shooter actually, he was apparently told by the people who were above him, like, why don't we just cancel the book? And he actually had Denny O'Neil, who was the editor on the book. He had him fire the old writer off of it and put Frank Miller on there. And I think it became like their best-selling title.
It did, yeah.
It's,
Frank Miller, like, Daredevil was his first great success, and he basically single-handedly turned the comic around and kind of made it into one of Marvel's premier titles. Like, since the Frank Miller era, Daredevil has been known as, like, a solid perform. This is all relative, by the way. It doesn't perform well, because nothing at Marvel performs well, but as a solid but unspectacular performer with a lot of critical attention given to it. Now, I have read some of the supposedly acclaimed non-Miller Daredevil comics, and I found them quite mediocre. Like, I read the Undertaker story by, I want to say Brian Michael Bendis. I could be wrong. But whoever it was it was a very popular, very critically acclaimed Daredevil story. So I read it with some high hopes. And the best that I could say is that the artwork was interesting, the story was not good, and it was certainly nowhere near the level of Miller. Uh, Now, Miller claims that he took the story because Daredevil was a dying comic and he wanted a challenge to prove himself. So he said, "Give me Dare." So he asked them to give him Daredevil, and they said, "Sure, it's on the way out anyway." Miller made a great joke about Daredevil where he said, "See, the reason I like Daredevil is that his superpower is being blind. What do you even do with a character like that?" So he considered Daredevil like a challenge, and by all accounts, he succeeded spectacularly.
I was gonna say, if this is a good point to break in, if anybody has something else to add, please stop me. But I was gonna say, regarding Daredevil issue 1, once you've seen Kirby's artwork, you can pretty much pick it out anywhere else. It makes I don't know that I paid attention to it the first time I read it, but yeah, in hindsight, looking back, yeah, that's a Kirby cover. The thing I was gonna ask Vincent is, what were the differences between Stan Lee's editor time as editor in chief of what was by then Marvel Comics? It went through the names Timely, Atlas, and maybe went back to Timely before being Marvel in the 60s. What was the difference between his style and Shooter's style, and which one was better given the limitations of the uh, medium, not the medium, the business?
well, here's the thing: is I don't think Stan has as much executive ability as Jim Shooter does. But Jim Shooter is a Stan fan. I don't know how much if you know the origin of Jim Shooter. Have you guys read any interviews that he's ever done?
I
No.
have not, so please enlighten us.
Okay, so basically he started writing when he was 13 years old. And he read, comics like the Donald Duck comics as done by like Carl Barks and stuff like that. And he read some Superman stuff and he enjoyed it. And he ended up getting sick one time, so he ended up going to the kids' hospital, and they had piles of comic books. And he saw the DC comics, and they were all pretty in okay condition, and he was reading them, and they were the same thing he saw last time. And then he saw these pile of Marvel comics, and they were completely ratty because people had done that. And he loved the Marvel comics, and he loved how Stan Lee and presumably, I don't know what exactly he read. I think he read Spider-Man, so he would have liked Steve Ditko, had done this. And so he ends up basically sending a comic to DC Comics, and he specifically applies to the Legion of Superheroes because he thought it was terrible. And the comic got accepted. He's 13 years old. And he
Holy
started
cow.
doing, yeah, he was 13 years old. He's been in the industry for a really long time. I think he might be officially the youngest person to ever enter the industry.
He beat Stan Lee by about 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, he's actually younger. I think Stan was like 16 and a half, I think, when he was hired at Timely.
Something like that.
Yeah, 16 and a half. I think he ended up trying to say he was 17 later to make himself appear older. But you have to remember, Stan Lee, he was in there because he had like family connections. Jim Shooter, he had no connection to the DC opposites. He just sent in a comic basically, and they bought the story. But so he started off at DC Comics for a while, and then the editor found out that how old he was. And it's always funny how he tells the story when he's being told by the editor, Mort Weisinger. It's like, and the editor asks him, well, how old are you? And he says, well, I'm 14. He says, put your mother on the phone. And then he ends up flying up to New York. And Mort Weisinger was the cigar chomping, very intelligent, and by all accounts appears to have been a competent editor, but he was like the cigar chomping editor from hell. He was actually called over the phone. He would get yelled at by Mort Weisinger. He was called, Mort called him his charity case. So it was a hostile work environment, that's to put it nicely.
Yeah.
So he ends up leaving later. He ends up, I think, working for Marvel for a little bit. He ends up going back to DC. When he's at DC, Mort Weisinger actually kind of trains him in the business a little bit. And then he ends up coming back to Marvel in the 70s, and he's an editor in there. But again, it's organized chaos. They went through so after Stan Lee stopped being the editor-in-chief because there was a buyout of the company, Roy Thomas was the editor, and then Len Wein was an editor, and then Jerry Conway was the editor, and then Archie Goodwin was the editor. And this is all within the span of I think 6 years or something like that. It was just total organized chaos. And he was apparently the absolute last person to be offered the job for editor-in-chief, and he ended up taking it. And he ended up turning around the company.
Okay, so we've been moving through slowly and kind of gone out of order a little bit, which is fine. I think it's interesting, so I have no problem with us doing that or anything like that. But getting back on track slightly, so what is, in your estimation, the real problem with the comic book industry? What has killed it? Because I will contend that the comic book industry, as it is today, is not dying. It is effectively a walking corpse. It is dead and cannot be saved.
What would also be a good way to write comics and actually make money off them and produce good stories?
Here's the thing. I'm going to say this. There's really two substantial problems, and one of them is that really come to mind. In general, there is very little real investment in talent. And this has always been a problem since day one. And this is part of the reason why nobody ever wants to stay there. So anybody who wants to seriously change it, you can't have all these little piecemeal efforts. It has to spend money on it. And this means that you got to be willing to spend the cash on it. And this is one of those things, you can't be cheap about it. Because if you consider in the old newspaper days, when you had the person who was the cartoonist who did all of the work, basically, they would hire assistants who might do this, but the idea was one person was the sole creator. And you saw what I quoted you about Milton Caniff getting $8 million to do that one. So you have to have some model that doesn't go too fast, but you also have to have one you also have to have a company that's willing to offer training on it, because there is a great degree of visual storytelling that has to be done simply by actually making comics.
Okay, so you would say one of the big problems is they're not willing to pay the most talented creators.
This has been a problem since day one. I've never seen one that actually was able to do that. The only exception, I think, is when Jim Shooter was running it. And he was actually willing to spend that. And I suspect it was because of his time as a talent that he was very sympathetic to that. Because he had been working, since he was 13 years old. He helped pay off. His dad actually had a problem because he was a steel worker, and he ended up getting some kind of physical problem. He couldn't end up working, so he actually helped pay for the family by doing his comic book work. So he was very sympathetic to that.
Okay,
But
so that's one of the things that Shooter did that helped turn around Marvel Comics for a decade or so.
yeah, he was willing to pay the talent, and he took it very seriously, even though he was not always perfect about it. But he's one of the and the difference is especially too that the way that they set the royalty thresholds, you could actually get money off of it. Whereas when DC first started, most of their comics didn't qualify for royalties. So it was when he set the royalty rate, it was done in such a way that even if you were on a very low selling comic, you would still probably get some royalties.
Okay, so
Basically,
that's
basically, he so the artists and the writers could eat, and maybe have some extra money to put in the bank afterward.
Well, they could also get really wealthy too, because you have to remember, the problem with how it's run is that nobody's willing to invest the cash in it, and especially considering how much work you have to do. Again, going back to the cartoonist as the full model, it's just not worth it if you're being paid poorly. It's hard to survive off of it.
Hmm.
And he was willing to spend the time to do it, and that's part of the reason why. Not the only reason, but part of the reason why his era was just so much more successful. Stan just never did that as much. I think he was working from an era where a lot of the talent was a little bit more. They were more referenced to like the newspaper comics, and there was more like cartoonists in the classical sense where they wrote and drew their own stuff. So he had a lot easier talent pool to work with in that sense. He could assume that
So,
people had an understanding of this, whereas when Jim Shooter was doing this, he didn't necessarily have that assumption that people were as well trained or had a better understanding of this. So he spent the effort to train it.
ah, so Stan had a bigger talent pool to pull from. They knew the business more intimately, and they knew what to expect out of it. Whereas Shooter's um, era, you didn't have as big a talent pool. The people who did have talent didn't have any place in which to practice it because they were aiming for comic books instead of, say, newspaper funnies. And so he had a better chance and more impetus to go for a better model of the business than Stan did.
Yeah, and I think the difference is also in the executive one because the top management changed. Especially because like Stan was kind of always under Martin Goodman, and I think Martin Goodman just didn't care about it. The president of Marvel was Jim Golden. He had actually done paperback publishing for I think it's for CBS Books. I can't remember what it was. He ended up getting fired from there for that one. So the upper management I think was a little bit more sympathetic to doing royalties. In fact, Jim Shooter was talking when he first talked about implementing the royalty plan. Jim Gallen was like, he said, "Oh, and he was Jim Shooter was complaining to Gallen that he wanted to implement royalties, and he quotes Jim Gallen saying, "We don't pay royalties." Like he was just so confused by it because the standard, if you're publishing prose books, was that yeah, you did get royalties. Like, can you imagine if Jack Kirby had like gotten the sales numbers and he had actually gotten royalties at the time?
yeah, that
Like
is an
Ditko
interesting
getting
thought.
royalties? Like
So, what would you say nowadays then? Like, that's dying. So they're not paying talent, and they're not nurturing talent or training properly. What's the other issue? Because I know what I'm thinking in my head is the distribution model, and I'm wondering if you're going to say that.
the distribution model. Here's the thing: is the reason why it died, and this is part of why I wanted to talk about the split with children. Is that when you aim for children, they don't have as much pocket money as adults do. So you can't raise prices as easily to go off and to help offset costs because your children just don't have as much money. The fact that they were aimed at children or very young adults meant it was hard to shift the prices upward or to try to find an alternative business model that would pay more. Because one of the reasons why comic books stopped getting exposure on the newsstands is that they were too cheap. And I remember this because Chuck Rosansky, who is one of the guys who founded the direct market, and he's also friends with Jim Shooter, he actually talked about when he was first starting off, he was discussing with the guy who was explaining him how distribution worked. It was a guy, Emil something. And he said, and the guy, Emil, he said, I'd be perfectly fine with comics disappearing because I don't make any money off them. And it was the fact that they were so cheap for so long, there was no reason for anybody to distribute them. And if you compare this to something like Mad Magazine, which was the only publication from EC Comics that survived, they actually they changed their model. They got to like magazine size, hence Mad Magazine. They did in black and white. They kind of were iffy about advertising, and they kind of ended up getting rid of it later. And they increased the price to 25 cents when the average comic book was like 10 cents. And if you look at the postal statements, there's these if you want to use the first class mail, you have to give the federal government a sort of an average of what your circulation was for the year. And if you actually go on a website called Comic-Con and you do Mad Magazine circulation figures, you can see that from 1960 to about 1982, the average sales for Mad Magazine was over 1 million copies a year for 2 decades, while everybody else was kind of declining. And that's because, and I suspect partially because of the fact that they were willing to up their price and they were willing to be competitive with other magazines. And I think
but Mad Magazine ended up kind of dying as well, though.
Yeah, but people talk about having problems with distribution. I work for CVS. Up until a couple of years ago, you could still get Mad Magazines and CVS. But you'll notice that they increased the price to get in there. They were willing to take a chance about increasing their prices, and they just never increased their prices. So I think for a lot of comics, they're probably, and this is going to sound strange, they're probably too cheap. Now, the problem is you can't really do the magazine model anymore because all like the really disposable stuff that you have for magazines is on the internet. And I'm not sure how you would monetize that. So I think anything, if you're going to be serializing stuff, it's going to have to be through the internet. You're not going to be doing physical copies. If you're going to
I was going to say, that actually is a really shocking comment to me, because that is like the opposite of what I would have thought. One thing that I noticed very quickly is that I can get an incredible, what to me looks like, though I'm sure it's probably making them boatloads of money, an incredible deal on Shonen Jump. I have the Shonen Jump app on my phone. I pay $3 a month, which is like a nothing cost, right? And for $3 a month, I get the entire archive of Shonen Jump for free, 24/7. On my phone, I could pull it out and read it anytime. And Marvel, meanwhile, is charging, $5 an issue of comics. That's absurd in terms of price difference. Like, that's so far above, you're probably talking like 100,000%, markup or something crazy like that, in terms of just the sheer amount of comic that I'm able to read. Now, so I would think that, what you're describing here, it sounds as if the distribution, what they're using to distribute comic books is crippling the industry.
Why they had to retreat into the direct market is because they simply weren't competitive with other magazines. And that was because of the cheapness. It's because they stuck to the business model of having cheap. They actually just lost the place for it. They basically excluded themselves from mainstream, from wide distribution because they were so insistent on being cheap. And that always confuses people. But if you read people who were there at the time, they'll talk about the fact that, that they made so little money, like Chuck Rosansky. They didn't make money off of it. So there's no incentive to keep these things on the stand. people have to remember the 10-cent price when they first came out was actually competitive with other types of magazines at the time.
This makes me, yeah, man, though, like, the way that you're describing this makes me think that there's just something about the industry that is so completely broken that, like, our assumptions of even how it has to work need to change. Because, like, I know that the Japanese industry that I know a little bit about, which is why I keep going back to it. I don't know much about Europe, though. I know European comics do very well. But I know a little bit about manga. And manga is also doing incredibly well right now. And I don't know, I know that the industry has its issues. Mainly its issues are that it treats artists, its creators, I should say, generally, very, very badly. To the point where they regularly get ill and not so irregularly commit suicide, or then get completely disillusioned with the industry and their treatment and things like that. Like the Bleach creator Kubo hates Shonen Jump. Tagashi worked himself to sickness, and like basically stopped making Hunter x Hunter. The creator of Berserk died young because we can't say for sure because of overwork, but it certainly seems if overwork played a role in his death. And even people like Oda, who Oda loves working on One Piece, and he, seems to be pretty happy with his job and does not seem to have any regrets about it. But if you actually read, his comments and kind of, it sort of takes a long time of reading him to see this stuff come out. But he talks about how he needs to, like, sacrifice his social life or whatever. Araki eventually left Shonen Jump because Shonen Jump had him on a weekly deadline, and then he went to a magazine that put him on a monthly deadline, and his art quality went way, way up. He started taking more breaks, and he just generally seemed like a happier person, though he doesn't... Araki doesn't... This is the JoJo's Bizarre Adventure creator, by the way, for people who don't know, but... And Araki doesn't seem to have anything particularly bad to say about Shonen Jump or anything like that, but that seems notable to me. So this is the flaw of the Japanese system. The flaw of the Japanese system is that it badly overworks creators to the point that it affects their health. And that's not good, and I do think that there is a problem there. But the flip side here is that right now the manga industry is making bank, and they are not selling at prices as high as Marvel and DC. So I guess what I'm saying is, what can we emulate there? What are they doing that's allowing them to keep their prices low? Surely it isn't just, well, they just don't treat their workers well. Like, there's got to be something besides that, or people would leave. Like, there is money in that industry. Where is it?
And see, haven't studied the Japanese industry as much, so I can't tell you. I know that I've seen stuff that suggests that the circulation of Shonen Jump actually peaked in the 90s, and it's actually been going downhill. So for Japanese standards, it's lower than it was.
No, so part of the problem with that is that now they have Shonen Jump online, and you have subscription services. Like I said, I have the app on my phone. Shonen Jump's circulation has gone down, but Shonen Jump's, like, its worldwide distribution has not.
Well,
If
you
that
also have to remember
makes
they're probably more competent on average. I mean, you have to remember, in general, the average is not very good in the industry. I think probably this Sursova is texting stuff in the Discord chat, and it's making me laugh. That probably would be better to copy the French model, which is what people typically say with the European model. Their comics are a little bit bigger. Their comics are a little bit bigger, and they come out a lot slower. They come out like once or twice a year. I remember because when I was there's an essay that I posted by John Workman. This is back when Superversive SF was still online, called The Comic Book Crisis. And I read that essay multiple times, and there was a line, I think I figured out around the 5th or 6th time, and it said, editors en masse have failed to learn that the average comic person cannot turn out on a monthly basis the 22 to 24 pages of what constitute a comic book. So it's always just been too fast. It's always been a very serious problem. It's just the demand of of the industry itself is just too much for most people. Most people just cannot draw that fast at quality. And demanding that standard for most people is just simply not reasonable.
It's difficult to write on that kind of basis as well. A monthly basis might be easier, but even that would, for some people, be too much. They couldn't
Oh
handle
yeah.
it, and for writing on a weekly basis, you'd have people having panic attacks. Not all people. Some people would thrive under that kind of model, but other people would freeze up, have panic attacks, get sick, or even, as Anthony pointed out with the manga, commit suicide.
I mean, that's always been
So
a
some
problem. It just has to be slower because we don't have we can't assume that most people are probably going to be fast when producing that type of artwork. It's just not a reasonable assumption. And I think the fact that people who try to use the manga comparison, I think might be assuming the American artists would be able to produce that, and I just don't think the history plays that out in America. Even with the newspaper comics, you usually had to get a bunch of assistants, and even then, the quality was I don't want to say it was terrible, but they're not producing as much as the Japanese are. If I had to guess.
this brings up something I was actually going to ask about. You said that comics are too cheap. Could that be a holdover from the original days when comic books, particularly, were first published? They were published on cheap paper, so you weren't necessarily losing money. It was, I don't know what the term would be, but it was, you were basically making a profit from something that was so cheap you could just as easily throw it away.
Comes from well, 10 cents was basically competitive, so that's not really the issue. I think the biggest part of the reason why they remain cheap is partly because, again, the children's audience. For the most part, if your primary audience is children, you're going to be a lot more hesitant to increase the price on it because you can't assume that your you can't assume the children's audience can absorb a cost increase in your stuff.
That brings me to another point, and I don't know if we have time to cover it, but I was astounded to learn ages ago that the biggest buyer of Captain America comics during World War II was not children, it was adults. It was the guys overseas in Europe. They were reading these books hand over fist. That was where most of Captain America's books were coming from. So I just, what the divide there, we might have to go into next time, but that's always kind of floored me. How did it go from the GIs overseas can read this and little kids can too, but the GIs are reading more? How did it go from that to comics are for kids?
Well, because the comic books were always for children. That was just probably military stuff. So they had more of an effort to try to sell that to them. I think that the biggest thing to understand is that the comic book industry has a problem because they never really had an adult audience until fairly recently. So in some ways, the problem that the industry has is that it's not only simultaneously has to get new kids, but it also simultaneously has to reach the adult audience simultaneously. And they have to sort of rebuild genres that haven't been necessarily um, that haven't been, like crime comics, for example. They have to rebuild on those, and they have to
Yeah.
rebuild the romance stuff
I don't
essentially
know.
from scratch.
What's shocking to me about what you're saying, like, and I have no reason, by the way, to think what you're saying is wrong. I think it's probably correct. But what's shocking to me about it is that it's like it almost feels like the industry is so broken. Uh, like the industry is so broken that we're saying that the one of the problems is that prices weren't raised to match the rest of what was coming out at the time on newsstands and magazines and whatever. Which, sure, that's true, but I'm like, then how are comics making bank in Europe and Japan? like, sure, yeah, part of it is that they treat their workers badly. Okay, yes, that is true. They abuse their workers and thus are able to get out work faster, and that is not a good thing that we should be emulating. But I can't imagine that's all of it. Like, there's something different about their industry. And, the fact that it's doing well in Europe too, as far as I know, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think European worker, the European industry is known for abusing its workers, and they're doing incredibly well as well. So it's like something in how we're doing things is just so totally broken that it makes me wonder, like, surely there is another way. You know,
Well,
but
it's
what
just
could it be? I don't know.
yeah, with somebody that's the million, that's like the million dollar question, and nobody has a good answer for it. I think that's a big part of the problem is that the model itself has been broken for so long. Nobody knows what it should look like, and it's
I think, so my opinion of it was always that, like, I think what Arcaven is doing with comics seems like a good path to go on because they're emulating the Webtoons model. And from, if we are to trust Vox, and I don't think he's lying, so, like, as far as the Arcaven model goes, I think that that is a good approach for the future, but it's going to take time before we see if it's really a viable path, right? Like, we don't know yet. It's gonna be a while. These things don't happen overnight. Rome wasn't built in a day type thing, right? Like, so will Arcaven be the answer? I mean, I'm not saying it won't be. I think it might be, but we don't know yet.
well, and again, the other $1 million question is how much is he paying his people? Like, what does he think is a good like top
Yeah, I
top rate for
genuinely don't
talent?
know.
And that's the biggest question, because if they're not willing to pay for the top talent, like we know from the newspaper comics that if you are willing to pay people the money to do this, they will show up and do it, even for even not necessarily all that great working conditions. But if he's not willing to spend the money on it, he's never going to be able to get the influence that he wants to, because this is an issue. I'm going to say this: a lot of it is a money issue, and always has been in the industry. And this is why, like, I get, like, I know Vox has like turned down money from like big investors to do this, which is smart. Which is probably smart considering the philosophical orientations of the people who are doing it. And we won't go elaborate too much further because I know that we are supposed to be ending soon. But he has to find some way to get money for it. And if he's not going to be able to do that, he's not going to be able to have the impact, because you got it. It is very very hard work to do,
Yeah,
and you don't
I
have
mean,
the
I don't
data.
know. I don't know what Arcaven is doing currently.
As I said, but the question is always, how much money is he willing to spend on it, and how much effort is he going to spend on really developing new talent? Because if he's not going to do those two things, he's going to have a rough time within it.
My thought. So I was published by Castalia House, and the deal on God Robot was that we got 50% of the royalties. Comics, of course, are a completely different industry with, instead of one creator, obviously some comics do have one creator, but generally you have multiple people working on one comic, and it's a whole different, plus it's being hosted online, so there's all sorts of different things. But I will say that 50% of the royalties is way, 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 way higher than 5% of the royalties, that you get in traditional publishing. This is the book industry. So, going off of that and trying to extrapolate out to Arcaven, I would imagine that they probably get like more of the royalty percentage than you would get in the traditional comics industry,
Mm-hmm.
but they're still probably not making as much because it's going to take time before they can build up that audience. And that's just not really something, there's no way around that. It just does. Now, will they ever get there? I hope so. Like, I genuinely do. I really hope so, but I don't know.
We can only try out and see. And he's probably going to have more influence on the margins, than he is like in the mainstream one, which is it's how Vox works. That's appropriate for how he is as a business and how his approach is. So that's actually not really a problem. But I don't know. Considering now, I know that you've published with him, so that's not really an issue. But he is politically controversial. Now, there's a lot of it that's BS. But if he is that controversial, he might have to offer more cash for people who would be willing to stay and work with him. He doesn't seem like a bad editor. I have not worked with him at all, and I've only heard like second.
John C. Wright claims he's a great editor. He did not edit God Robot. I was the editor of God Robot. He just kind of looked it over. But John C. Wright claims Vox Day is a great editor, and I have no reason not to trust him on it. So
I don't. What I'm saying is, I don't think if it ends up failing, it will not be because necessarily of editorial ability. It's probably going to end up being a problem of just cash and attracting the talent and having them stay and develop it enough. But
they do have some talented people there. They got Chuck Dixon writing for Arcaven, who is incredibly talented. They have Stone Toss, who is doing very well right now. Now, granted, this is a different type of comic. This is more in the newspaper comic mold. But Stone Toss is also a millionaire, so say what you will. Oh yeah. Well, you know why he's a millionaire, don't you? Have you heard the story?
Oh no, I haven't. What's the story?
He sold NFTs.
That's funny.
And he became he sold a Flork, which is the little Stone Toss character. He sold a Flork NFT and became a millionaire off of it in 2 days, which is insane to me. But it happened. It's real.
That's pretty good.
I'm curious, and I don't know if we have enough time for this, but where do you see the independent market going, where you have crowdfunding for various comics, new issues each week? Does that seem to balance some of the problems in the industry, or perhaps even cancel some of them out?
There needs to be enough money flowing into the industry, which means it just has to get bigger in general, which means you have to get normal people to read comics again. And I'll say this, I'll tell you when I know that this sign that the culture has changed. When you see people, this was something I noticed years ago. When you see the phrase comic book separated from superhero, and as a consistent one, in the average public mind, I think that's the point where you'll know that it's become acceptable enough and widespread enough where it will be healthy. That'd be a sign that it'd be healthy. But I will say, the benefit of the individual people doing this is that stuff that's really niche that otherwise a publisher wouldn't necessarily take a chance on, but would be worth doing. That stuff can get made. That's always good.
Yeah, there was what was I going to say? Oh yeah, there's an anecdote here that I think is worth sharing that is analogous. So you guys, at least Caroline, might remember this. I went on a little mini rant a week or so ago, I want to say, because I found an article that was talking about, why haven't conservatives tried to do theater? Now, I love theater, and I am a big fan of theater, so I'm like, okay, I'm interested to see what the insights of this guy are. His insight was, I don't know, everybody wants to write a short story, which he's right. He goes, people are trying to take that with the arts, but the short stories aren't that influential, which is also true, by the way. But theater is very influential, and there is no reason that conservatives can't do a show. All you got to do is write a show, get a group of people, and then, perform at the local coffee house for 2 weeks. And then I, exploded, because I have been in the position where I have put on shows before. Now, renting out a venue, any venue, including a coffee shop, which, by the way, how are you going to get space in a coffee shop to do a full show? So, renting out a venue where you could do a full show in 2 weeks, for 2 weeks is unbelievably expensive. Now, you compare that to writing a short story. I could do that on a good day in roughly an hour, and I could publish it on YouTube as a Pinker to Go story or online anytime I want to, whenever I want to. So that there is absolutely, whereas if I'm putting on a show, I need to get a cast, I need to get a set, I need to get a location, I need to plan time for rehearsals, I need to plan time for shows. All of this costs money, none of it is free. There is absolutely no comparison between the two, and to ask why someone would do one and not the other just shows that you literally have no idea how to put on a show. You've never attempted it, you don't know anything about it. Comic book
Hmm.
strike the same way, where you're going like, well, why don't people just make comics then? Well, because comics are expensive. Like, way more expensive than writing books. There is not a comparison. It's completely different. Were you going to say something? I thought you were, Vincent.
Oh no, I was looking at Ben. He's saying, "Let me know when you're done."
Oh, I see.
In
Yeah,
the
so
internal.
that's actually because I was only waiting for you to finish to say something because I thought you were. But anyway, to finish what I was going to finish then the stream, I suppose. This was a very interesting stream. Your insights were greatly appreciated.
Mhm.
Uh, I had a lot of fun. I think that we should do this again and go. Since we really didn't cover as much ground as you would think, because we went all over the place, which is fine, because it was all interesting. But there's still a lot more to talk about: the history of Marvel and DC, how we got to where we are today, uh, as well as the Comics Code, and potentially just doing a stream on the Comics Code and the impact that it had. So certainly we'll plan for this again sometime. Uh, but as it is, I think that we are just about ready to close off. For everybody else, next week we will be doing, I don't know. Uh, I don't think that we have any specific plans for next week. If Ben is on, he could correct me.